For example, it suggested that the National Health Service teams who target people experiencing a first episode of psychosis could be expanded across England. The health service could save £290 million over 10 years, and wider society would benefit to the tune of another £250 million. So, in other words, they're looking for more customers. They know they'll be created, because when you get born into a system that's really like the Great Depression that never ends, and up to financial depression that never ends, and all you hear is bad news. And that's why most folk immigrated in the past. You get nothing but bad news coming out there. Factories closing down, going to China, this, that, the other, and unemployment, and more taxes all the time. Well, yeah, you get rather depressed. That's why folk drink so much. They make sure there's lots of cheap enough booze to keep you stoned. Russia did the same thing. They always do that, in such systems, socialist systems, because in Orwell's 84, you had to line up for your food that was not food at all. It was like a food. It was like a meat, but it wasn't meat at all. But you could grab a bottle of this cheap vodka anywhere at all, and that was the same in Russia. Very cheap. Because keeping you stoned all the time stops you from rampaging on the streets. Maggie Thatcher said that herself when she extended the drinking hours in all the bars. She says, better to have them in the bars drunk, spending their welfare money, than having them marching on the streets and complaining about what really is going on. Democracy is a wonderful thing, isn't it? It's amazing we want to give this to the whole world. Well, you know who owns democracy, don't you? And it's not the people. It's not the people. But it's a good facade. It's a good facade, because even Lord Bertrand Russell, who certainly should know since he was up there in government as a lord, he said himself, democracy is a great cover because the people actually think it's their government. Quite good, isn't it? But when you go into mind control, as I say, it's always been the goal of those at the top. Mind control. How to get a perfectly obedient, well-behaved society. And you'll find with Aldous Huxley, you go into Huxley's histories to find out who these guys are. They're related to the Darwins. They're related to all the big players of the past. And, of course, Julian Huxley was a lot worse than Aldous Huxley, and more forthright in what he wanted to happen to the public in mind control aspects. He wanted all children to be utterly brainwashed by the world state, and that's why he belonged to UNESCO. He also wanted to drastically reduce the inferior types by abortion, and he got awards from family planning associations for coming out with that beauty. Anyway, it says here in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World Revisited, he says, in the two preceding chapters have described the techniques of what may be called wholesale mind manipulation as practiced by the greatest demagogue and the most successful salesman in recorded history. But no human problem can be solved by wholesale methods alone. The shotgun has its place, but so has the hypodermic syringe. In the chapters that follow, I shall describe some of the more effective techniques for manipulating not crowds, not entire publics, but isolated individuals. You always start with the individual, because technically most people are much the same as everybody else in the crowd, you see. And this is in the course of this epoch-making experiments on the conditioned reflex, Ivan Pavlov. This is the guy who got all the acclaim and peace prizes and all the rest of it for shocking dogs and giving them nervous breakdowns. Again, without emotion. He just stood there and said, interesting, as his things getting fried. But he also used children too. Now, as I said before, they've hidden more of what they've done from the public until now. It's only now that some truth is being allowed out of academia, who've always known what they're up to, but as to what they were really doing. Ivan Pavlov was also, and I've got photographs of it and some video of it, putting the same children, orphans, through the same experiments, having them strapped down. He had holes cut in their neck, and he was collecting the saliva, giving them shocks, and trying to put in these conditioned reflexes and so on. They're beautiful heroes of history, these characters, aren't they? Beautiful heroes. We should all follow them, right? Anyway, Pavlov observed that when subjected to prolonged physical or psychic stress, lab animals, I guess that includes the children too, exhibit all the symptoms of a nervous breakdown. Refusing to cope any longer with an intolerable situation, their brains go on strike, and so to speak, and either stop working altogether, the dog loses consciousness, or else resorts to slowdowns and sabotage. The dog behaves unrealistically or develops the kind of physical symptoms which in a human being we would call hysterical. Well, hysteria, that's the last part before. See, you know you're for the chop. You see the same thing in the old Vietnam. videos will show you where the Vietnamese are down on their hunkers, as they're called. They're hunkered down, their hands on their heads, and they're peeing themselves, pooping themselves, and they're just shaking all over. That's what happens because it's a last appeal to humanity not to kill them. That's what it is, and animals have it too. That's really what it is, folks. It's not just not a physical thing that happens. It's a psychic thing that we're supposed to recognize as something in distress. But of course, scientists don't see it that way. Some animals are more resistant to stress than others. It says dogs possessing what Pavlov calls a strong excitatory constitution break down much more quickly than dogs of a merely lively as opposed to a choleric or agitated temperament. Similarly, weak and inhibitory dogs reach the end of their tether much sooner than do calm, imperturbable dogs. But even the most stoical dog is unable to resist indefinitely. If the stress to which he is subjected is sufficiently intense or sufficiently prolonged, he will end by breaking down as abjectly and as completely as the weakest of his kind. Now, why am I talking about this? It's because they've been using this all over, and they're still using it in all these camps where they do torture. You see? Utter torture. It's amazing how civilization brings us closer to some beautiful ideal of humanity, isn't it? And these guys keep saying it's progress and civilization. That's what they keep telling us, progress and civilization. And it's okay as long as you're not one of the guys who are grabbed off the street and put under this kind of torture. But that's coming, folks. What's been done abroad to others is coming home. Because these guys know that they will bring riots upon everyone. And they're ready for it. They're ready for it. They've been creating armies, internal armies, for about 30 years now in response for what's to be done. And they have weaponry, non-lethal and lethal, of course. And even the non-lethals can be turned up to be lethal. They've got all this stuff, and they will eventually be using this on the streets of America and elsewhere as they crash the economy again, which they will do, by the way, as they trade us into a new system. So anyway, Pavlov's findings were confirmed in the most distressing manner and on a very large scale. Then he goes through the 2 world wars and battle fatigue and all the rest of it, etc., etc. But the amazing thing was, once they'd broken them down, they could recondition them and reprogram them and find that they could give them political ideologies, which they'd never forget. They would be mind-controlled forever. So first you break them down, then you recondition them. And that's what, again, the wonderful Pavlov was up to there. This technique has been used fantastically well, especially in places like North Korea, for instance. Still used today. And no matter how badly they're harmed by their handlers, they end up loving them, literally loving them. And that was reconfirmed again by one of the documentaries I watched on the brain, where these 2 lovely heroes again who got prizes for it and so on did experiments on monkeys. You've all seen those, I'm sure, where they deprived monkeys for a year. They put them in the hole, they called it. No contact, no nothing, when they were very young. And they brought them up, and these monkeys were just basket cases forever. Other ones, they would give them a dressed up dummy to look like mummy, and eventually down the road, mummy would give off shocks and so on, so they're totally confused. And rather than jump off the dummy mummy, they'd hug them all the more. And that's why abused people love their abuser, by the way. It creates an exaggerated form of need out of a basic instinct, which is a natural thing to be bonded with the mother. You'll actually crave more affection from the one who abuses you. That's what Orwell had in his 1984 book. Amazing how abuse can be worked on the public. It can be used in so many other ways on a mass scale as well. Never forget that. Abuse there's many techniques of creating abuse. And we also have, of course, people like Huxley and others talking about how the people would come to love their servitude. What we're coming into, a world of service. This is, your duty will be to serve the world state. We see Obama, he passed the law in Britain and in the US. We saw the same thing getting passed in Britain with this new coalition communist government. And everybody in Britain eventually is to do at least 2 months per year national service, and it doesn't have to be just in the military. It doesn't have to be just in the military. So, They go into breaking points in the individual and so on. By the way, there's a professor in Canada who came up with the idea for sensory deprivation. When you see those guys that are put in places like Guantanamo and etc., they have these hoods on their heads. Well, it was born by a guy in Canada, professor here, Professor Hebb, I think his name was, H-E-B. And the big gloves on as well to stop you having physical contact with a human being as such, and to disorientate you as well. And then, of course, they have them crouching against a wall. They can't sit down on the floor. They've got to crouch down again in that hunkery position, which creates a tremendous strain on the body. And you feel no human touch at all. You can't see what's going on. And it's the same techniques basically they're using as Pavlov was using as well. It all came from these wonderful Nobel Peace Prize winners and stuff like that. You know, great scientists, the experts, you understand, the guys we're supposed to follow. Anyway, Huxley goes on about how Hitler used torture, mass extermination of different so-called inferior types. You know, Jews, Gypsies, they also had Slavs galore as well, all slaughtered. And they go into the types of tortures used, but not just him as well. So the Soviet Union was doing it long before Hitler. Hitler got a lot of ideas and techniques from the Soviets, and that again came out in the Soviet story. Excellent video to watch. It says, they go on about the creation of stress just for the right time, length of time. There's a particular, they've got it down to an art. It's simply a matter of applying the right amount of stress for the right length of time. Then to the treatment, the prisoner will be in a state of neurosis or hysteria and will be ready to confess whatever his captors want him to confess to. But confession is not enough. A hopeless neurotic is of no use to anyone. What the intelligent and practical dictator needs is not a patient to be institutionalized or a victim to be shot, but a convert who will work for the cause. It says, turning once again to Pavlov, he learns that on their way to the point of final breakdown, dogs become more than normally suggestible. Now, they're really talking about people. I hope you understand that. And the behaviorists know this too. They've got a lot more video than I've got. It says, new behavior patterns can easily be installed while the dog is at or near the limit of its cerebral endurance. And those new behavioral patterns seem to be interadictable. It says, the animal in which they've been implanted cannot be deconditioned. That's permanent. That which has learned under stress will remain an integral part of its makeup. You can create terrorists this way. You understand? Do you really think it's they've admitted even that the top general, it was for the US, who was in charge of a lot of this torture stuff, said they were just rounding people up from marketplaces and so on. People who knew nothing at all. They didn't have any information to impart. What were they really doing with them? What were they really doing with them? They're creating the terrorists for down the road, who'll be on the payroll of the CIA. That's what you do. Psychological stresses can be produced in many ways. Dogs become disturbed when stimuli are unusually strong, when the interval between a stimulus and the customary response is unduly prolonged, and the animal is left in a state of suspense. When the brain is confused by stimuli that runs counter to what the dog has learned to expect, when stimuli make no sense within the victim's established frame or reference. Furthermore, it's been found that the deliberate induction of fear, rage, or anxiety markedly heightens a dog's suggestibility. If these emotions are kept at a high pitch of intensity for a long time, the brain goes on strike. When this happens, new behavior patterns may be installed with the greatest of ease, it says here. So don't think of it for a minute. They're talking about just dogs here. And as I say, Pavlov experimented on an awful lot of humans and prisoners and children. Pavlov also was brought in to bring in the same school system that we have running across the world today. How to indoctrinate children perfectly in the schoolroom. FDR's wife went over to see him, and she thought Pavlov she said he was her hero. And she said, it was so wonderful to observe all these well-behaved children, not spontaneous like the American children going to school, but they're so well-behaved. And she thought that was just wonderful for the socialist system. You know, for those folk down there, you know, the peasant class. You think something's changed somewhere? Where have you been? Back with more after this break.